G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Life of Messiah. I pray that this will be a blessing to you and help you to grow in the grace and knowledge of your Saviour Jesus. Thank you for joining in. Last session, we looked at the signs accompanying the death of Jesus. We had an earthquake. We had the resurrection of some saints from the tombs. They were resurrected, but they didn't come out from the tombs till after Jesus was resurrected. We had the rending or the tearing of the veil in the temple. We had a Roman centurion who, seeing everything that's going on, he realized that this man on the cross, Jesus, he actually is the Messiah, came to faith. And we also had a lot of fear amongst the Jews because of all these things happening. And remember also back then that the bodies couldn't remain on the cross in that area because it was coming to the Sabbath day. So they had to bring about a speedy death for these men on the crosses. So what they did was, for the three of them, they would, the two rebels crucified with Jesus, they had their legs broken when they come to Jesus. Well, he'd already given up his spirit. Remember, he's in total control. And so just to make sure, a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear. And so now we see that he is, they're all dead and they're removed from the cross. And we have two secret disciples now come to take the body of Jesus down. Remember, at this time, none of his disciples are there. But we have two, up until now, secret disciples. They come to get the body from Pilate. And this is Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, both of them members of the Sanhedrin, both of them Pharisees. Now, they take Jesus down, and what they did was they bind him in strips of linen cloth, and they then placed him into Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, a garden tomb. So this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 53:9, that he was buried in a rich man's tomb. Now we see with his death, we see the last stages of Messiah's humiliation. What was that about? Well, the God-man, the sinless one, dying the death of a sinner. Now, and also with this humiliation, we see that none of his close disciples and friends were there for him. But in saying that, we also see the first stage of his exaltation. And we see this in the fact that Jesus is now buried in an unused rich man's tomb in a garden. So this is the first stage of his exaltation. So tonight we're looking at his resurrection, and that's what we're going to see from paragraph 183 to paragraph 191. Just by the way, this book here, if you can see this, this book contains all the things that we're teaching here. It's the life of Messiah from a Messianic Jewish perspective, and I just got a shipment in today. Okay, let's kick on. Now, we've seen Jesus. He's been crucified, buried. There is some confusion over the day of his death, and we're going to look at that tonight. The day on which Jesus died. Some people say, well, he was crucified on Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Thursday. Problem with when the majority read the Gospels is that they don't understand the Jewish context here. The Gospels clearly tell us that Jesus was killed on a Friday and he is placed in the tomb before sundown. Now, it says also it's before the Sabbath, and we need to interpret the Sabbath the way it's interpreted throughout the scriptures. And it normally means from sundown Friday until sundown Saturday. And the scriptures emphasize this, and John 19:31 and Mark 15:42 and Luke 23:54 and Matthew, or all of them, Matthew 27:62, clearly state that Jesus died around 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. He was then placed in the tomb before the Sabbath began, which by Jewish reckoning was when 3 stars appeared in the night sky, which was around about 6 o'clock Friday evening. In the Hebrew Bible, the only time the term Sabbath is used of a day other than the 7th day of the week is the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. All the other times it's used of this Sabbath day between sundown Friday, sundown Saturday. Now, we also see that in the scriptures here, it clearly says to us that the women visited the tomb on the day after the Sabbath. Which day is that? First day of the week, Sunday. So besides the Gospels, ancient and Jewish records such as the Talmud confirm that the day the Messiah died, and this is not Christians writing this is the Jews writing this. It says it confirms that the day the Messiah died was a Friday during Passover, because it says on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. And another manuscript, a Florentine manuscript adds, and the eve of Sabbath. So Jesus was crucified on the eve of Passover, which was the Friday, and it says on the eve of the Sabbath. And this Talmud quote refers to Jesus's trial and execution, and the Florentine manuscript mentions twice that he was executed on the eve of the Sabbath, which is Friday, and twice it mentions that it was at the Passover, which is why John stated that the Sabbath was a high Sabbath. John in John 19:31 says, the Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation that the bodies should not remain on the cross upon the Sabbath, for the day of that Sabbath was a high day, asked of Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. And finally, the Talmudic quote here reveals the exact charge against Jesus, claiming that he practiced sorcery, he seduced Israel, and he estranged them from their God. Now, this reflects what occurred when Jesus was officially rejected on the grounds of being demonized, and we see it in Matthew chapter 12. You know, the interesting thing here, though, is that the rabbis never denied that Jesus performed real miracles. And in this particular quote, they admit that he did. But still, the main point of this quote is that Jesus died on a Friday before the Sabbath and during the week of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So teaching that his death occurred on a Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday violates the clear statements of the Gospels and also historical accounts or historical documents like the Talmud and the Florentine manuscripts. Now, next big controversial question is, how many days did he stay in the tomb? Many people believe that the statement 3 days and 3 nights refers to 3 full 24-hour days or 24-hour periods. The crucifixion would have occurred earlier in the week with Jesus in the tomb for a period of 72 hours. Problem with that, though, because if Jesus had been in the tomb for 3 full days and was resurrected the moment the third 24-hour day had ended, what day would that be? It'd be the 4th day. 4th day. Not only that, when did he meet the 2 disciples on the Emmaus Road? He met them on the Emmaus Road on Sunday afternoon. Quite a few hours had passed since the resurrection, and we see this in Luke 24:13-32 and Mark 16:12-13. Not recognizing Jesus, the disciples related to him the events of the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion, and early reports of a resurrection, pointing out that it is now the third day since these things came to pass. And we see that in Luke 24:21. The only way that Sunday afternoon could still be the third day is if the crucifixion occurred on Friday. It has to be on Friday. Now, for those who misread the Gospels, we need to, it can be confusing when you consider all of Jesus' statements, because quite often they appear contradictory. For example, sometimes he prophesied that the resurrection would occur on the third day, Matthew 16:21, for instance, or Luke 9:22, or even Acts chapter 10, verse 40. Other times he said it would happen after 3 days, meaning on the fourth day. And we see that in Matthew 26:61 and Mark 8:31 and John chapter 2, verse 19 to 20. Then again, he said he'd be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. So, for the average reader of the Gospels, it could be it is very confusing. But to reconcile these various statements, what we need to do is we need to look to the Jewish context of the Gospels. And the Mosaic law stipulated that the new year began on the 1st of Nisan. Nisan was the month in which Jesus was crucified. And in the Jewish mode of counting years, any part of the end of the previous year or any part of the new year, whether it be a few months or even just a few days, they counted it as a full year. For example, a king takes the throne on the last day of a year. He would then be viewed as having ruled the whole year. So a day later, the new year began, but the biblical records would read the second year of his reign. He's only been on the throne for 2 days. Last day of the previous year, first day of the new year. But they record it as the second year of his reign. So the second day of his reign would be considered the second year of his reign, because even the first day of a year was officially considered to be 1 year. So you got to think about this in days now, because this way of reckoning time goes to days as well. So even the last hour of a day or the first hour of a day counted as a full day. Now, Jesus was in the tomb during the last few hours of Friday. Remember, he died at 3 p.m. Friday. Then he was in the tomb the whole 24 hours of Saturday. And then in the early hours of Sunday, which in the Jewish reckoning of time, it all counts as 3 days. So if we look back at Jesus' statements, which seem contradictory, we can easily reconcile them when we understand the Jewish frame of references. First, resurrection was to be on the third day. And although he was in the tomb in the early hours of the third day, later on that same day, Jesus was resurrected. So he was resurrected on the third day. Second, resurrection was to be after 3 days. And since Jesus was in the tomb part of Sunday, it counted for all of Sunday. Therefore, from a Jewish point of view, counting 1 full day and the 2 partial days as whole days, partial days, part of Friday, part of Sunday, Jesus was not only resurrected on the third day, he was also resurrected after 3 days. Third, when it says when Jesus says 3 days and 3 nights, we can also reconcile this. It's a figure of speech referring to any period of time that touches 3 days and is used in the Hebrew scriptures several times. If you look back into 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 12 to 13, and 2 Chronicles 10:5, and we see it also in Esther 4:16 and Esther 5:1. What are we saying? All of this is to say that the Gospels were written by Jews using the Jewish frame of reference to reckon time. And in keeping with their frame of reference and terminology, Jesus was buried on Friday before sundown and before the Sabbath began. He was resurrected sometime after the Sabbath on Sunday, the first day of the week. And from a Jewish perspective, the Sabbath had already ended and the first day of the week had already begun as of sundown on Saturday. So we see 3 days, 3 nights, after 3 days on the third day, they all can be accounted for in the Jewish reckoning of time. All right, so now we see the opening of the tomb, and we see this in Matthew chapter 28, verses 2 to 4. It's now Sunday, the 17th day of Nisan. It's the 9th of April, 30 AD. And this is close to the early hours of Sunday morning before sunrise. And we see here 3 things happened. First up, in Matthew 28:2, behold, there was a great earthquake. This is the second one, because remember we had one at his death and now one at his resurrection. Second thing, an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and he rolled away the stone, breaking the Roman seals on the tomb. And remember, by Roman law, this action was punishable by death. But who's going to try and enforce that with an angel? It says the angel's appearance was as bright as lightning. Third thing, because the angel's appearance was as lightning and his raiment white as snow, in Matthew 28, verse 3, fear now falls upon the Roman guard, and they became as dead men. They were scared stiff. They were so filled with fear they could not even run away. So they were just petrified. And when did this happen? It happened at or shortly before sunrise, before the women came to the tomb. See the visit of the women. And we see this in Luke 24, 1 to 8, and Matthew 28, 5 to 8, Mark 16, 2 to 8, and John 20, verse 1. Now, their Gospels appear here to give 4 different accounts of the women's visits to the tomb. There are differences, but they actually complement the information found in the other 3. And if we bang them all together, put all the 4 accounts together, we get a complete picture of the events of the resurrection morning. So now it's early Sunday morning, and the different Gospels record different elements of that morning. But it seems that the visit of the women was in 2 groups, because in John chapter 20, verse 1, it says, now on the first day of the week, Sunday, comes Mary Magdalene early, while it was yet dark, onto the tomb. So she arrived at the tomb first, it's dark, and she sees that the stone had been rolled away, and she left before she saw any of the angels. She was probably working on the assumption that Jesus had been taken away, and she doesn't closely investigate, and immediately she rushes back to Peter and John to tell them the body has been moved. Now, behind her were a second group of women who arrived at early dawn, according to Mark 16:2, because Mark writes, and very early in the first day of the week, they come to the tomb when the sun was risen. So now sun's up. Mary Magdalene, it was dark. This bunch come, sun's up. And what do they see? They see 2 men standing by them in dazzling apparel. That's Luke 24:5. And that's the angels. And now they'd seen also that the stone had been rolled away. Now to this group of women, the angels give a message. They told them Jesus had risen as he said he would, and there was no reason to seek the living among the dead. Luke 24:5. Second, they were to go and report to the disciples that Jesus was risen, and we see that from Matthew 25:7. He says, go quickly and tell the disciples he's risen from the dead. And the third thing was to tell them to proceed to Galilee, where Jesus will meet them. Now, this was the second time that the word came to the apostles that they were to move towards Galilee. This is the second time. They were supposed to have done it by now. The first time that they were told to go to Galilee was at the last Passover, when Jesus told them that they were to leave Jerusalem immediately after his arrest. And we see that back in Matthew 26, verse 32, and Mark 14, verse 28. But they didn't understand what he meant. So they were caught by surprise and they never left the city. And from the Luke account in Luke 24, verse 8, we're told that at this point, the women remembered the prophecy of Jesus about his death and resurrection on the third day. And that's in Luke 24:7. And in Mark 16:8, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. They told no one outside the apostolic group, but ran to bring his disciples word. That's in Matthew 25:8. And we're told that the apostles didn't believe him. They didn't believe him. And we see the report now in John chapter 20, verse 2 to 10, and Luke 24, 9 to 12. Now, these two accounts tell us what the women said to the apostles, and in particular, what Mary Magdalene said to John and Peter. She said, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb." Remember, she hadn't seen the angels. And Mary now reported to John and Peter, but in Luke verse 10, and the other women with them told these things unto the apostles. So all that Mary could say was that the stone had been rolled away and the body was not in the tomb. But then we see that in the John account, the other women reported the message of the angel, that the resurrection had taken place. So we have the 9 disciples who got the second message disbelieve the report. And according to verse 11 of the Luke account, these words appeared in their sight as idle talk, and they disbelieved them. To them, to the disciples, it was idle talk, or leros in Greek. If you look at your concordance or your dictionary, it translates this word as simply that which is totally devoid of anything worthwhile. It was just idle chit-chat, nonsense, rubbish. However, Hippocrates seems to have used it to describe a certain form of delirium. And in medical contexts, the term described the talk of a sick patient delirious from pain. And the fact that Luke was familiar with this is another indication of his profession. He's a medical doctor. Now, after Mary tells Peter and John, they both take off running to the tomb. And John outruns Peter, and he arrives first. And notice something else here. Simon Peter therefore also came following him and entered the tomb, and he beheld the linen cloths lying, and the napkin that was on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. So when Peter caught up and looked in, they both entered the tomb and examined the burial strips. Now, Peter rushed in first, as he does. He's always action before thinking. Now, the burial strips or cloths here had been wrapped around Jesus's body, but there was a separate cloth that had been wrapped around his head, rolled up separately. And what this implies here is that Jesus was resurrected right through the cloths, leaving them as they were formed about him, because they weren't unwrapped. Remember, Jesus wasn't raised with a natural body like Lazarus was, but now he's raised with a glorified body. They had to unwrap Lazarus, but Jesus, he was just resurrected right through the linen wrappings. What this tells us here is that there's no validity to the Shroud of Turin. Whatever the image on the Shroud of Turin is, it's not Jesus. Now, when these two disciples leave the area, they both come to different conclusions. Peter, in Luke 24, verse 12, departed to his home, wondering at that which was come to pass. He didn't know what to believe. He didn't know what to think. But John, on the other hand, he left the tomb and he believed. He believed that the resurrection had taken place according to verses 8 to 9 of John chapter 20. Now we see the first appearance to Mary Magdalene. And this is in John chapter 20, 11 to 8, and Mark 16, 9 to 11. Now, Jesus' first appearance is to a woman, not a man. This is important. Excuse me. If the story of the resurrection had been a fabrication, this would not have been the way to fake it, because on the Jewish law, the testimonies of women were not acceptable. The 2 or 3 witnesses necessary in a court of law had to be men, never women, as a woman's testimony was not considered valid. And that's why when the women testified about the resurrection to the disciples, as we just saw, even the disciples did not believe them. If it had been a story fabricated by Jewish believers, as unbelievers have often claimed it's a story made up, the first appearance would have been alleged to be made to a group of men. They would have tried to make it as believable and acceptable to their audience as possible, making sure that all the witnesses were men, not women. But they had to report it in the way it actually happened, with a woman as the first witness to the resurrection. And the fact that the report of the first appearance was to a woman actually helps to authenticate the resurrection story. You know, when Mary comes back to the tomb, she saw 2 angels, but she didn't recognize them as such because they appeared as young men. We see that in the Mark account, Mark 16 verse 5 and John 20, 11 to 12. When the angels asked, "Woman, why do you weep?" Verse 13 of John, she revealed her belief. "They've taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him." This is verse 13 of John 20. Now, when Jesus appeared to her, she did not recognize him immediately. And it's in verse 14 of John. And he now asks her the same question. "Woman, why do you weep? Whom are you seeking?" Now, she assumed him to be the gardener, and she probably assumed that he was the one who has removed the body. She asked, "Sir, if you have borne him hence, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." That's John 19:15. Jesus then called her by name, and there was probably something in his tone of voice or the way he pronounced her name was familiar, because at that instant, she finally recognized him and called to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, meaning my rabbi, my teacher. Now, this delay in recognition occurred at several of his post-resurrection appearances. And one reason for this is that his resurrected body had changed to such a degree that identification was not immediate. However, enough things remained the same so that eventually those who saw him recognized him, and Mary identified him by the way he called her name. So this may imply that the sound of his voice remained the same. Some things change, but others remain the same. Now, the cleansing of the heavenly tabernacle. As Mary Magdalene now moves towards him, Jesus says to her, "Touch me not." John 20 verse 17. Why would Jesus stop her from touching him when later that day he allowed other women to do so? A week later, he even commanded Thomas to put his finger on his hands and his side. We see that in John 20 verse 27. Well, we have 2 possible answers for this. And the usual explanation is to take the Greek word translated as touch as meaning don't cling or don't hang on to me. In other words, do not try to keep me here on earth because I must leave. And this is the Greek word used here. This is the clinging on, hanging on. The other Greek word for touch is to touch lightly, to feel lightly. And this is the word that's used when Jesus says to Thomas, touch my hands, touch me lightly here. That's the first option. Now, there's a second option as to why Jesus told Mary not to touch him. And this one here is related directly to the Mosaic law. He said, "Don't touch me, for I am not yet ascended unto the Father." And we see that in verse 17 of John 20. His statement here specifically related to the high priest's activity in the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. High priest began the day by removing the multicolored garments he wore on a daily basis. Once he was undressed, he underwent a ritual immersion. Then he put on white garments, symbolizing purity. And he only wore these white garments in one day of the year. That was in the Day of Atonement. After this, the priest went through the procedure of offering the blood of the sacrifice for himself and then for Israel. And once he began this ceremony, he was untouchable. And when he finished, he'd take off his white clothes, he'd undergo a second ritual immersion, and he'd put on his multicolored garments. If anyone touched him, touched the high priest between the first and the second immersion, it rendered him unclean, and he could not enter the Holy of Holies to sprinkle the goat's blood upon the mercy seat. He could not make the atonement with the blood. Therefore, until the ritual was completed, the high priest was untouchable. The tabernacle built by Moses on earth was a copy of something already existing in heaven. While the earthly tabernacle could be cleansed by blood, which we see in Leviticus 17:11 and Hebrews 9:22, the heavenly tabernacle required cleansing by better blood, innocent human blood. And in Hebrews 9, verse 23, it says, "Therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, blood of sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these." Jesus, in his function as the perfect high priest, ascended into heaven at some point to sprinkle his blood in the heavenly tabernacle to cleanse it. And we see this in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, 9 verse 11, verse 12, verse 24, and chapter 10, verse 12. Now, Ezekiel 28, 11 to 19 explains why this tabernacle in heaven needed to be cleansed. Satan, a cherub, the highest order of celestial beings, had defiled it. Ezekiel 28 verse 14 says, "The anointed cherub who covers." He's now been cast out of the mountain of God. This is Satan he's talking about here. And in Ezekiel 28 verse 18, it says that you profaned your sanctuaries. Plural. Those sanctuaries were the holy place and the Holy of Holies in heaven. That's what Satan defiled. Isaiah 14 tells us that Satan wanted to make himself like God. This was Satan's sin. And when he sinned in heaven, he defiled the heavenly sanctuary. And because these are heavenly sanctuaries, they require cleansing by better blood. Now, Jesus had to ascend into heaven to sprinkle his blood in the heavenly sanctuary. And when he encountered Mary, his comments suggest that he had not yet cleansed the heavenly tabernacle, making him untouchable. Once he performed his duty as the perfect high priest, he could return and people could touch him. Now, after telling her this, Jesus admonished Mary, "But go unto my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." And he's referring to his disciples here, his brethren. And the word brethren here reflects the new relationship he now had with the apostles as a result of his death and resurrection. However, at this point, the disciples did not believe the first report that Jesus had been resurrected. We see that in Mark 16, verse 11. And now we have the second appearance to the other women. And this is in Matthew 28, 9 to 10. After Mary now left, the other women arrived, and Jesus greeted them, and they came and they took hold of his feet and worshipped him. This is Matthew 28, 9. Why the difference? Why could these women touch him? And in fact, this act of devotion here surpassed mere touching or feeling, and it shows that sometime between talking to Mary Magdalene and talking to these women, Jesus had ascended into heaven, sprinkled his blood, and became touchable. The fact that the second appearance was also to women and not to men, again, strengthens the argument that the gospel accounts are genuine. Any Jewish author fabricating a story would not have written it this way, but the gospel writers had to report it this way because that's the truth. Jesus told the women, "Go tell my brethren that they depart into Galilee, where he's going to meet them." This is now the third time. This is the third time that the apostles receive a very clear message: leave Jerusalem, go to Galilee, I'll meet you up there. But they're still in town, they never left. Now we have the report of the guard. This is now the rejection of the second sign of Jonah. We see this in Matthew 28, verse 11 to 15. Chief priests had rejected the first sign of Jonah when, remember, the sign of Jonah is resurrection. They rejected the first sign of Jonah when they rejected the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And now we have in this paragraph the initial rejection of the second sign of Jonah, which was a rejection of Jesus. Their rejection of the truth was by this time a proven rejection of God. It was not simply ignorance. Some of the Roman guard reported to the chief priests about what had been happening, and they were concerned about the breaking of the Roman seal on the tomb because it meant that they would be liable to be executed. So rather than report to Pilate their story of an angel that looked like lightning rolling away the stone, which probably would be pretty hard for Pilate to believe, they went to the Jewish leaders instead. So now a new conspiracy is now developed. Chief priests and the elders, they called a meeting to decide what should be done. So this conspiracy now is the chief priests, the Sadducees, and the elders, the Pharisees. And they come up with the stolen body theory. And this has been repeated throughout the centuries. Now, notice the stupidity of their agreed statement. In verse 12, we see here in verse 12, it says that when they were assembled with the elders, the Pharisees, and had taken counsel, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, "Say that his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept." If they were sleeping, how could they know who took the body? So the statement itself is a bit, it's confused logic here. Therefore, it would not have stood as permissible evidence in law. But the chief priests also told the guard that, listen, if the report reaches Pontius Pilate, listen, we will intervene on your behalf so that you won't be executed. They say, if this come to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and rid you of care. Matthew 28:14. So now after the Passover, after Passover, which is now finished, the governor would return to Caesarea, possibly never to hear of their failure. Well, actually, it would finish in 6 days' time after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now in verse 15, we see that the soldiers, they take the money and they did as they had agreed to. So the report of the theft was now spread amongst the Jews, and it was still the official view at the time that Matthew wrote his account of it. And even to this present time, it is still the official view of the Jewish historians. Somebody stole his body. If the body of Jesus had been stolen, there would have only been two groups interested in stealing it. Either his friends or his enemies. A neutral person would hardly risk breaking the Roman seal and facing execution. Now, if his disciples had stolen the body, it seems impossible to believe that the same disciples later on would be willing to die a painful martyrdom for something they knew to be a lie. These same disciples later underwent a tremendous persecution for preaching the resurrection. James, for example, he was beheaded. According to church tradition, Peter was crucified upside down. Matthew killed by the sword. Philip was hanged. Bartholomew was flayed, skinned alive. Andrew was crucified. Thomas was speared with a lance. Matthias was first stoned and beheaded. And of those outside the apostolic group who were eyewitnesses, Mark was tortured to death. Jesus' half-brother was thrown down from the pinnacle of the temple and then, stoned. Jude was shot to death with arrows. Every one of them died horrendous deaths. For a lie, highly unlikely. And in every case, prior to their execution, these disciples were given the option of giving up their preaching of Jesus or facing martyrdom. Would they have been willing to suffer such cruelty for a lie? No way in the world. It makes no sense that if the body was stolen, it was stolen by his friends. The only reasonable explanation for their actions in the book of Acts and beyond that is that they believed Jesus was resurrected. The opposite view is that his enemies stole the body. And we see that in Acts, immediately after Pentecost, the apostles began to preach about the resurrection. And the Sanhedrin had to stop them. If they had the body, they could have produced it, and all the preaching would have ended there. The fact that they're incapable of producing the body shows that they were not guilty of stealing it either. In actual fact, you realize it takes more faith to believe in the stolen body theory than it does to believe in the resurrection. Now we have the third appearance, and this is to the disciples on the Emmaus Road. And we find this in Luke 24:13-32 and Mark 16:12-13. Now we only have the name of one of these travelers here, and that is a man called Cleopas, probably because he was the husband of one of the Marys of the gospel, possibly. These were disciples, but not in the group of 11. They were part of the other larger group of disciples. This Cleopas may have been the one who replaced James, the half-brother of Jesus, and the one who wrote the Epistle of James. And he was murdered. In fact, he was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple. Cleopas later, after James's death, assumed the headship of, and led the church of Jerusalem across into Pella in the first Jewish revolt in AD 66. If it's the same Cleopas, it makes sense that he's the only one named in this account. Now, in Luke 24:13-32 and Mark 16:12-13, they're now on their way from Jerusalem back home to Emmaus. They're walking along, and now a third man joins them. They didn't recognize who he was as the resurrected Messiah. They didn't know who he was. And they were talking about the events which had occurred involving Jesus and his crucifixion, and also the report from the women which had filtered through apparently that a resurrection had occurred and that Jesus had actually been seen by them. So Jesus, wants to draw out their conversation. So he asked them, "What are you guys talking about?" And we see in their answer in the Luke 19-21 what they were discussing. Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, which was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and have crucified him. But we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. Now they still didn't grasp what the nature of the redemption was. But notice what else they said in verses 21-24. And besides all this, today is the third day since these things were done. And certain women also of our company made us astonished, which were early at the sepulchre. And when they found not his body, they came, saying that they had also seen a vision of angels, which said that he was alive. And certain of them which were with us went to the sepulchre and found it even so as the women had said, but him they saw not. It was Peter and John who had run to the sepulchre and found the tomb as Mary had said. Now, from Luke 24:19-21, it's clear here that they believe four things. First of all, they believe that Jesus was a prophet of God, authenticated by his works and words. Second, they believed he was tried, condemned, and crucified by the religious leaders. Third, they had believed that Jesus was going to redeem Israel. What they didn't believe was the women's report that they had seen angels who declared that Jesus was alive. Because the apostles saw nothing, the disciples on the road to Emmaus disbelieved the reports of the resurrection from the women. See here the expression that it was the third day since all this has happened. It again pinpoints that we cannot allow for 3 24-hour days. Jesus had it in the grave for 72 hours. The time at which the disciples were now speaking would have been after the 3 days, the sighting of the women and the investigation by Peter and John. Jesus had been in the grave for a full 72 hours. It would now be the 4th day. Yet they said here in the passage, it's the 3rd day. It's now the 3rd day. So we need to calculate how long Jesus was in the tomb by Jewish frame of reckoning. Okay, Sunday afternoon, still the 3rd day. So it confirms here again that Jesus died on Friday. In verses 25 to 26 of Luke 24, Jesus upbraids them for their unbelief. Oh, foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. And he begins to explain to them the messianic prophecies from the Hebrew scriptures. Beginning from Moses and from all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. This is 27 of Luke 24. And this was to show them the very things which had happened to him had been predicted to happen. And when they now arrive outside of Emmaus, Jesus made as though he was going to continue on his journey. But they invited this stranger to go in with them to their home. It's time for the evening meal. And they came into the house and they got ready to break bread. A Jewish idiom for breaking, to break bread is a Jewish idiom for having a meal. It's not communion, all right? They're preparing an ordinary meal. And during a Jewish dinner, the host of the house, not the guest, traditionally recites a blessing over the bread. However, there's a Jewish tradition that says if two eat together and one of them is an educated Bible scholar or a sofer, and the other of them is an ordinary man, the sofer or the Bible scholar gives the blessing of the food. Having heard Jesus' exposition of messianic prophecy, the disciples recognized him as a Bible scholar and then now give him the opportunity to blessing the bread. And at this point, they recognized Jesus in the way that he blessed and broke the bread and passed it to them. At that moment, their eyes were open and they suddenly recognized him, and just as suddenly, he disappears from sight. So they immediately now head back to Jerusalem to report what's happened to them with the resurrected Messiah. And Mark points out in verses 12 to 13, but the disciples didn't believe them either. So the third report is still not believed. And the Lord was still testing the disciples' faith to see, are they going to believe in this resurrection or not? Now I have the 4th appearance to Peter. And we see this in Luke 24, 33 to 35, and also in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5. Although we saw in Mark's account in the previous paragraph, what we saw there was that Cleopas and his companion were disbelieved by the others. While they were still reporting in Jerusalem, they would encounter further news. In 1 Corinthians 15:5, of the 11 disciples, Peter was the first one to see the resurrected Messiah. And it was probably for the purpose of comforting him. When Jesus predicted Peter's failure at the last Passover, he also said that the apostle would be reestablished. And this appearance was probably simply necessary to fulfill this promise. And this he needed this as a result of his earlier denials. It may have been to reaffirm his prime role as the head of the apostles, a role that is recorded in the book of Acts. And he was again now established as the leader. And now we have the 5th appearance to the 10 disciples. And this is in John 20, 19 to 25, and in Mark 16, verse 14, and Luke 24, 36 to 43. So up till now, we've had 3 messages have now reached the 11 that they should get out of Jerusalem and go to Galilee. And because of their unbelief in the resurrection report, what do? They still stay in Jerusalem. They don't believe Jesus is resurrected, so why go to Galilee? So now Jesus has to make his appearance to them in Jerusalem. And when he appeared to them, he again upbraided them for their unbelief. 10 of the 11 were now present in this encounter. When therefore it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, when the doors were shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, this is John 20, verse 19, here they're still fearful of being arrested, and they hide inside of a house where Jesus suddenly appeared to them and said, "Peace be unto you." And this is the customary Jewish greeting. Shalom Aleichem. So when the apostles finally saw him, they still did not believe they were seeing a resurrected individual. Instead, they were filled with fear because they thought they were looking at a spirit or a ghost. And we see this in Luke 24:37. And again, Jesus scolds them for their unbelief, which they demonstrated here in three specific ways. First of all, their unbelief was shown in that they were still in Jerusalem. They did not go to Galilee as commanded. 3 times he commanded them to go to Galilee, but they're still in Jerusalem. Second thing, they did not believe the witness of the women or the disciples from the Emmaus Road, Cleopatra's companion. Third, when they did finally see him, when they finally did see Jesus, they thought that he was a ghost. They thought they were seeing a ghost. And now to prove to them that he's not a ghost, we read in the Luke account, Luke 24, that he now invites them to touch him. Handle me and see, for a spirit has not flesh and bones as you behold me having. Spirit doesn't have flesh and bones, but a resurrected body is solid matter. Jesus also showed the apostles his hands and his feet so that they could see the nail prints still there. Remember, although Jesus was resurrected, he was not yet glorified, because a glorified body would not have these imperfections. And in fact, we see in Revelation 1:12-16, when John sees him, he doesn't see any of these imperfections on him. Now, when the apostles still had trouble believing that he was the resurrected Jesus, Jesus now asks them for something to eat. Give me something to eat. So they handed him a piece of broiled fish. He now eats that. And again, ghosts don't eat. Resurrected bodies do not need food to live, but they can enjoy eating, which he did. Ghosts can't eat. They haven't got a mouth, they haven't got a throat, any of those things. Ghosts don't eat at all. Now at this point, Jesus now gives them the first of the 3 final commissions. And Jesus told the 10 the 3 things here. First of all, he gives them an authoritative ministry. They were now being sent by the Son, as we read in the John account, verse 21. He said, "Peace be unto you. As my Father has sent me, even so send I you." Second, the apostolic authority that had been given to Peter to bind and to loose. Remember, binding and loosing is in a judicial sense. It's the authority to forgive or not forgive, not in the salvation sense, because only God can do that, but in the church discipline sense. That authority is now extended to all the apostles. He says, if you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. Again, this forgiveness of sin was in a judicial sense and not in a salvation sense, as only God can forgive in a salvation sense. Only God has that authority. This concerned binding and loosing in a judicial sense, in the sense of either punishing or freeing someone from punishment. That's what binding and loosing means. And then he breathed on them and said, "Receive ye the Holy Spirit." John 20, verse 22. So at this point, they now receive the Holy Spirit, but not in the New Testament sense, all right? They would not receive that until the event in Acts chapter 2. This was the Old Testament ministry of the Spirit in order that they might understand the things they were to learn during the 40 days of his post-resurrection ministry. Remember, they struggled to understand spiritual things. The blockage in their understanding was now being removed. They had a lot of relearning to be done in the next 40 days. In 1 Corinthians 2:9 to 1 Corinthians 3:3, it describes here the role of the Holy Spirit in the believer's mind, enlightening the mind of the believer to help them understand the spiritual things of God. On at least 4 occasions, Jesus had clearly communicated to his apostles the whole program of his coming death and resurrection. And each time he added more details, yet they simply did not understand the message. So they were surprised when it finally occurred. They were surprised at the crucifixion. Between the resurrection and the ascension, Jesus has a lot to teach them in preparation for their mission, which is described in the book of Acts. So they needed to understand all these things. And when they received the Spirit, the Holy Spirit now began his work of illumination in them. Now, at this point, only of the 11 apostles, only 10 were present. Thomas was absent. And in verse 24 to 25 of the John account, although Thomas would get 10 reports Jesus was alive, he said, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And that was Thomas. And this brings us to the end of this session. There are contact details there. You can contact us at our website, ariel.org.au, or email us at info@ariel.org.